Remember that in the Mark 8 text we were looking at, Peter does confess that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus then encourages the disciples not to say much about it, and we've seen why that's probably so. Then, of course, we also saw how Jesus turned to use the title Son of Man to refer to himself, and particularly in this context, to his coming suffering and death. Son of Man, as we said, is by far the most common title Jesus used to refer to himself. Scholars tend to divide the Son of Man sayings into three basic types. You have what some call the earthly Son of Man sayings, where Jesus simply refers to himself in his earthly life. Then you have the texts such as we saw in Mark 8:31, where Jesus talks about the Son of Man suffering and dying and ultimately being raised again. And third, you have texts where Jesus refers to the Son of Man coming again in glory, as in the Olivet Discourse in Mark, for instance, 13:26. This Son of Man title is one of the most difficult to pin down. Its Christological significance is not immediately clear. Nowhere do we see Jesus explaining what he means by the title. And because he uses it in so many different ways to refer to himself in so many different contexts, it's very difficult to pin down just what he means by it. Here is a case, as so often is the situation when we're studying particularly the life of Jesus and the Gospels, that background becomes absolutely key. Jesus is teaching and ministering in a thoroughly Jewish context, using the language and the concepts and the imagery that the Jews of his day were familiar with. So we can assume that when he calls himself Son of Man and doesn't really explain it, that he would have been communicating something to his Jewish audience that they would have been able to be familiar with. Unfortunately, scholars can't agree on what this background is. The most common use of the phrase Son of Man in the OT is actually in the prophecy of Ezekiel, who constantly refers to himself as Son of Man, and whom God addresses as Son of Man. Clearly, the sense here is simply to address Ezekiel as a human being, and hence the contemporary English Bible translates this in their rendering as simply the human one. A number of interpreters over the years have thought this might be what Jesus intends. A number of the early church fathers, for instance, spoke about Jesus as Son of Man on the one hand, his humanity, and Son of God on the other, to connote his deity. It's unlikely, however, that this is entirely what Jesus means by the phrase, as we will see. Some other scholars think that Son of Man was simply a way of referring to oneself, looking at some Aramaic evidence. This also apparently doesn't go far enough. Still others think that Messiah might have been a messianic title being used in current apocalyptic Judaism, a certain movement within Judaism that was very significant and had influence clearly on the New Testament authors. The title Son of Man seems to be used this way in the very important intertestamental book, 1 Enoch. But the problem here is the dating of 1 Enoch. When we're looking at New Testament backgrounds, we have to keep our eye on the date of the Jewish materials we're referring to. Many of the Jewish books that are commonly referenced as background for the NT, in fact, were written after the time of the Gospels, sometimes centuries after the time of the Gospels. It would be like using a modern edition of Sports Illustrated to illustrate the use of English in the 17th century. In the case of 1 Enoch, while there certainly is doubt about the date, it looks to be a book that post-dates the Gospels, and thus probably does not provide a good background for the Son of Man title. Finally, we come to Daniel 7, and here is the most fruitful place to sort of root the Son of Man, because Jesus quotes passages from Daniel 7 when he refers to himself as Son of Man. In the Olivet Discourse and in the trial before the Jewish leaders, Jesus talks about himself as Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's from Daniel 7:11 to 13. In Daniel, Son of Man is a way of talking about the people of Israel. You might remember that the chapter features a vision in which Daniel sees 4 beasts rising from the sea, each of these beasts representing a kingdom, an earthly kingdom that would have power and sovereignty successfully in the world. Then comes the vision of one like a son of man, which is identified later in the chapter, Daniel 7, as the people of Israel. In other words, the human figure represents the people of Israel. Now, putting that all together, we might suggest, therefore, that what Jesus is doing in claiming to be Son of Man is claiming, in fact, to be the fulfillment of this vision of the people of Israel. He is the representative of Israel. As the Son of Man, he is the ultimate Israelite, as it were, an idea we're going to pursue a bit in a moment. And he makes a claim, therefore, that as the representative of Israel, he will ultimately inherit a kingdom, but he will inherit that kingdom through suffering. Because the context of Daniel 7 talks about the people of God, Israel, suffering, being persecuted, ultimately being vindicated by God and being given an eternal kingdom. Jesus, therefore, I suspect, uses the title Son of Man precisely because it didn't have a very clear, specific meaning. It was a title he could fill with the significance he understood himself to have. This would be why, therefore, the later New Testament authors tended not to use the title. It just didn't communicate anything clearly enough to be useful for them in talking in a significant way about Jesus. As Son of Man, then, Jesus claims to be the fulfillment of God's purposes in the creation and work through his people Israel, one who will suffer, be vindicated, and bring in an eternal kingdom.